Hey there folks, welcome back to Thoughts from My Writing Desk. This is where I sit down and I chat about writing and a couple of the ideas that are bouncing around in my head. Today I am drinking Dorman's coffee, which is from Kenya. It's good. Okay, let's dive in. So today's theme is world building. World building is huge in fantasy writing. It's the cities, it's the cultures, it's the history, and it's how everything ties together. Really, it's like its own character. So when I wrote my book, Journey to Khaldor, I needed a world that would work for a hero's journey. It's a quest. An anxious young gardener has to muster all of his courage and set off to save his sister who's been kidnapped by monsters. That's the story, and I need a world that can kind of help me tell that story. So my story needed a quiet land, where the story starts, a monster stronghold, where the story ends, and a bunch of cities and obstacles along the way that are going to force my hero to learn and grow. Okay, so let's start with the quiet land. My quiet land is called the Veld. It's a prairie landscape. I think that there's something also that's important when you're writing fantasy. Even if you're writing fantasy, there's something important about writing what you know. I live in Manitoba. I live in the prairies of Canada. So when I want to come up with a land that's peaceful, that's serene, that's maybe a little bit boring, I just have to look out my back window. Manitoba is a quiet, peaceful, serene land that's a little bit boring. So I don't need to use a bunch of imagination to come up with a place that I know what the fields look like. I know what the forests look like. I know what it feels like to grow up here, to grow up in this peaceful, serene, little bit boring land. So basically, my fantasy land, my quiet land, the Veld, is sort of like a fantasy version of Manitoba. That's my quiet land where the story begins, where it starts. That's where my hero begins his journey. Next, I needed a monster stronghold. That's where the story's going to end. I know I'm going to end up there, so it's really important that I create and I think about this monster stronghold. Mine is called Khaldor. The book is called Journey to Khaldor, and that's where the story ends up. This is the Gorgon stronghold. The Gorgon are the monsters who kidnap my hero's sister. So this monster stronghold, Khaldor, it needs to be mysterious. It needs to be rich in history. There was this war that took place a few decades before our story begins. It's called the Gorgon War. And this city was like a central, pivotal location in this war. Something else about the Gorgon War is that everybody in my world has some kind of a relationship with this war. Either they fought in the war, or they fled from the war, or they lost someone to the war, or their parents fought in the war. It's another piece of the world that sort of ties everything together. There is a shared history. There's a shared history in particular huge events that took place. And it being the Gorgon War, it also is going to tie us back to this city, Khaldor. It's a very important city in the mountains. Okay, so we have our quiet land and we have our monster stronghold. The next thing that I need is a bunch of cities and obstacles along the way that are going to force my hero to learn and grow. Now this is like the really fun part. Just like making up cities, environments, places. You know, you want to have desert cities, misty bogs, mountain strongholds. But something that's really important is we don't want these to just be like random things. They need to have a purpose. They need to be tied to the story. They need to be tied to the world. So is this bog just a really cool bog, or where does it exist? How did the bog form? Who lives there? How long have they lived there? Who's connected with this? Who knows about this? The bog is sort of a runoff from this forest over here and this mountain over here that would create a bog environment right there. And the creatures that live in this bog need to have evolved in this place. So for example, there's a city in my story that's called Lucona. It is at the base of the Celestial Mountains, this mountain range sort of where Khaldor is up on. So the fact that like they live at the base of the mountains connected with the open lands, yes, there's trade, but also these people are hardened fighters. They are adventurous fighters. Their walls are filled with trophies from their hunting, and their blades have been sharpened in battle. So we have all these factors. I mean, Lucona is a stronghold. There are forges, there are markets. Their walls are covered in like trophies and antlers and prizes from combat. But it's really important that when my characters enter this place, I'm not just like listing all of these things off. It's important that my characters experience this city through their own point of view. They're going to walk past some forges. Enough said. We understand, like, by describing the environment in a way that you can walk through it, we're going to pick up pieces of this history, of these traditions, of this culture, without having to understand fully everything. Because my characters don't understand fully everything. They're just experiencing the world as they go. So if there's going to be a takeaway, I would say that when you're building a world, ask yourself why. Why does this city exist? Obviously, it's going to exist because you have a story that's taking place and this city needs to take place for the story. Like, Lucona was a place where things need to get more serious. My main character needs to encounter some serious fighters because he's going to have to train up for this final confrontation. But also in the context of the world, how do these places exist within the world? What's the trade that happens here? What are the industries here? Why does the place exist, and what are the traditions, and what's the history that caused it to be how it is? Also, why do these traditions matter? Why is it important that they have trophies on their walls? What is it about that? Are they a proud people? If they're a proud people, in what other ways is that pride represented? The more you understand all of these different layers and components, the more real your world is going to feel. And again, we are creating fantasy, we are creating worlds of imagination, but in the end, at least for me, I want my stories to be grounded in reality. I want them to feel like real places that could actually exist. So, yeah, those are a few thoughts on world building. Next, it's time for some updates. So I'm working on my second fantasy novel right now, which is this nautical journey. I think the last update I had, my crew of my ship was about to encounter a great big question mark that's going to sort of like extend the mystery just a little bit further. They are now kind of like embedded in this question mark place that they're going to. And I'm writing this chapter, which is sort of like very mysterious and like things are about to go crazy. So I think something that's interesting is this is my second fantasy novel, and I'm already noticing some of my the patterns that I fall in with my writing, and I don't want it to feel predictable or that I'm running over the same type of character, the same kind of information. So sort of like taking that and shaking it up, trying to keep it interesting, trying to keep it unique, is a little bit of a new challenge that I'm encountering. But then also, like, it's just so cool when you go off into left field with your writing and you know something's going to happen here. And as fun as writing action is, I love writing action and kinetic stuff and dialogue and arguments. There's also something kind of fun about like laying a bunch of seeds to build up towards a mystery, or building suspense or intrigue or preparation for action. Something before the battle is really interesting. So that's the sort of chapter that I'm working on right now, is kind of this, completely different experience in the book. Like a question mark. It's just like, it doesn't really make sense in the context of the book, the place. It's sort of like It's kind of like a forgotten island. And I am going to make sure that I want to tie in like important character development does occur here. It's an important part of the story, but it's also it's something different, which is kind of fun. Yeah, so I'm kind of working on that chapter, and hopefully I'll have that ironed out in the next couple days, and then we're gonna dive into some action, which is always fun too. Yeah. Okay, so that's the update on the nautical book. Short stories. I have been writing a couple more short stories. I wrote 3 short stories that take place in Alduna, which take place in the world, and introduce 3 of the characters that are going to be in Journey to Khaldor. So after that, I just wrote 3 kind of other short stories. I wrote one actually, which takes place in Manitoba. It's about the pastor of a dying church. So it was a story that's sort of like a bit more of like a struggle with like faith and purpose. And then I wrote 2 other short stories that take place in Alduna again, 2 other fantasy short stories, but they're in places, they're not directly connected with Journey to Khaldor at all. They're completely other places. I just have this map that I've designed, and I have these kinds of stories that I'd like to tell. So it's just fun to sort of like picking spots on the map, or really in my mind, picking stories that I want to tell, and then figuring out, oh, where could this take place in the world? And again, having a fantasy world that's filled with like magic and intrigue and mystery and mysterious events and creatures is just so cool, because you can explore myth and legend in all of its many sort of incarnations and facets. So that's been really fun, writing short stories. Short stories are great because you can kind of like write, explore, go into something, and then you're done. It's not like a huge, long, drawn-out process. So there is a feeling of like kineticism and instant gratification, which is kind of joyful. It's a pleasurable writing experience. It's nice to be working on something longer at the same time, but it's kind of neat to do these little exercises, really, to kind of like work the muscle in different ways. Yeah. And in terms of essays, I've been writing a couple essays as well. Typically, I write an essay that pairs with a story. Like, I wanted to write something that wasn't fantasy at all. So I wrote this short story. It's called Fragments of Faith, which is about this pastor in Manitoba, with a pastor of a dying church. And I wrote an essay that goes along with that called Writing as Exploration, which is just talking about kind of exploring the idea of trying something new, trying something that you haven't tried. I don't tend to write stories that take place in the real world. I don't tend to write stories that are as dramatic as that one. So that was a bit of a different experience, and I wrote this essay called Writing as Exploration. Next, I did this one fantasy story, which is about a group of pilgrims going on a pilgrimage in the desert. It's called Flame of the Maracan. And there I wrote an essay to go along with that called Writing with Purpose, because that story, that short story, is really a parable. So I wrote an essay kind of exploring how I, at least, like to write meaning and purpose into my stories. I like to do it in a very particular way, because I don't want to sort of beat my reader over the head with the message. I want to do it lightly so that you can pick up the message if you're looking for it, but if not, maybe there's like at least a compelling story to read. And then I wrote an essay. I just had an idea for an essay called Name This Emotion, where I wanted to explore an emotion that takes place, an emotion that I feel quite often, which is halfway in between embarrassment and joy, which we don't really have a word for in English. Like that feeling that you feel when you're like taking a really big bite of food and it's too big of a bite, and someone looks at you and you laugh, and then they laugh, and suddenly you're laughing. You could have felt embarrassed about this embarrassing thing you're doing, taking a bite that's too big and food's maybe falling out of your mouth, but you feel joy instead. And it's particularly tied up with embarrassment. or with something you could feel ashamed there, but instead you feel joy. I feel that emotion quite often, and we don't have a word for it in English. So I just wrote an essay that kind of explores that a little bit. If you have a name for that emotion, please let me know. Yeah, and now honestly, if you have any questions or thoughts about my writing process or the writing process in general, please let me know. Okay, that about wraps it up for today. Next time I was thinking about exploring character development. But if you have any ideas, please let me know. Thanks for watching, and happy writing.